This is the first time each of you has told Congress this and the companies that you represent, and it is significant and important. Thank you. But it's also true that if it weren't for the actions of the big oil companies, we might have taken action to fix this problem decades ago. Mr. Woods, I want to ask you about some public statements that your predecessor, Lee Raymond, made in 1996 and 97 as the world was debating an agreement to reduce greenhouse gas emissions known as the Kyoto Protocol. Here's what Mr. Raymond said in 1996, and I quote, "Currently, the scientific evidence is inconclusive as to whether human activities are having a significant effect on the global climate," end quote. And I'd like to place his statement in the record without objection. And this was no slip of the tongue. In 1997, he gave another speech where he denounced the effects in Kyoto and said, quote, "The case for global warming is far from airtight," end quote. Mr. Woods, when Exxon's CEO made these remarks about the inconclusive nature of the scientific evidence, were they consistent with the views of Exxon's own scientists?
Yes, Chairwoman, thank you for the question. Appreciate the opportunity to address that. Our understanding of the science has been aligned with the consensus of the scientific community as far back as 20 years ago when you referenced our chairman at that time's comments. And as science has evolved and developed, our understanding has evolved and developed, as has our work and position on the statement.
Well, as you make your statement, I'm reminded of another hearing that we had with the tobacco industry. And we had all the executives seated in this room, and they were asked about their statements from their companies that the science was uncertain. And they said they did not believe that nicotine was addictive. Well, it came out that they lied. Tobacco, nicotine was very addictive. And now I'm hearing from you that the science that was reported publicly, where your executives were denying climate change, we know that your scientists internally were saying that it's a reality. So I was hoping that you would not be like the tobacco industry was and lie about this. And I was hoping that you would be better than the tobacco industry and that you would have come out with the truth, and I'm disappointed with the statement that you made. James Black was an Exxon scientist, and I'd like to put up on the screen what he told the company's top executives in a secret briefing back in 1978, more than 40 years ago. And he said, and I quote, "There is a general scientific agreement that the most likely manner in which mankind is influencing the global climate is through carbon dioxide release from the burning of fossil fuels," end quote. And Mr. Black was not the only Exxon scientist to recognize that burning fossil fuels would cause dangerous climate change. In 1982, Roger Cohen, one of Exxon's most senior scientists, wrote a private letter to Exxon's management, and I'm putting it in the record. He said there was a, quote, "scientific consensus about the impact of increased carbon dioxide on the climate," and there was, quote, unanimous agreement in the scientific community, end quote, that doubling carbon dioxide levels would lead to significant climate change. So I'm asking you, Mr. Woods, do you agree there is an inconsistency between what Mr. Raymond, the Exxon CEO, told the public and what Mr. Black and Mr. Cohen, both Exxon scientists, told top executives?
Chairwoman, no, I do not agree that there was an inconsistency. If you look at the full extent of that report, you'll find that the comments in the report and that briefing to our management committee, which was not a secret meeting, was entirely consistent with where their intergovernmental panel on climate change was and where the general consensus of the scientific community. And I think our position in that has continued to evolve with the scientific community. I think our messaging has been that this is a complex problem that's going to require thoughtful, practical solutions, and that has been something that we've continued to emphasize over time.
Reclaiming my time, I think the quotes speak for themselves. I'm putting them in the record. There is a clear conflict between what Exxon's CEO told the public and what Exxon scientists were warning privately for years. But you don't need to take my word for it. In 2019, two former Exxon scientists testified in this very hearing room. They were here where the tobacco executives were, and they testified before Representative Raskin's subcommittee. They said Mr. Raymond's statements were just plain wrong. One former Exxon scientist, Dr. Martin Hoffert, testified, and I quote, "Exxon was publicly promoting views that its own scientists knew were wrong. And we know that because we were the major groups working on this," end quote. And the disinformation from Exxon did not end there. In 2000, Exxon ran an advertisement in the New York Times entitled "Unsettled Science." And it said, and I quote, "Even less is known about the potential positive or negative impacts of climate change. In fact, many academic studies and field experiments have demonstrated that increased levels of carbon dioxide can promote crop and forest growth," end quote. So, Mr. Woods, was this the statement that climate change could actually be positive for our planet, consistent with the private views of Exxon's scientist?
Chairwoman, if you read the full article that was advertised that you referenced there, it concludes with a statement that says we know enough now that governments, people, and companies should be taking reasonable action to address the risk of climate change. So again, I would come back and say that our position in this space has been consistent with the general consensus in the scientific community. Our research was in line with that. It was a small
Thank you so much. Reclaiming my time, the documents tell a different story. Let me read you an excerpt from a 1982 memo, which I'd like to place in the record, that M.B. Glasser, Exxon's manager of environmental affairs, sent to Exxon management about the potential impacts of climate change. And he wrote, "There are some potentially catastrophic events that should be considered," end quote. He said those events could include melting ice caps and flooding along the East Coast, including in Florida and Washington. And another private memo from 1981 issued similar warnings. Mr. Cohen, a top Exxon scientist, wrote that it was distinctly possible that climate change would, quote, "produce effects which will indeed be catastrophic, at least for a substantial fraction of the Earth's population," end quote. And that also, unanimous consent to place in the record, Mr. Woods giving these grave warnings from Exxon's own scientists over and over and over again. Do you believe that it was ethical for Exxon to run a New York Times advertisement that downplayed the risk and instead highlighted the potential positive impact of climate change?
Chairwoman, I would again say, if you look at the full context of the memos that you're referencing, the messaging that came across in those full memos and is very consistent with what the general consensus of the scientific community was. And our advertorial that you mentioned, again, concluded that there's enough knowledge to know that we should be taking action, that people, governments, and companies should respond and take practical, reasonable action. And that was consistent with what the scientific community was at the time. And as time has progressed, we've continued to maintain a position that has evolved with science and is today consistent with the science.